Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ecosystem Aces. I am excited to be joined this morning by Trevor Manokore. Trevor, welcome.
Morning, Chip. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. You're on the other side of the world. It's Thursday morning your time. Is that right?
It is Thursday morning, bright and early.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Great to have you on, Trevor. And so Trevor is a team lead for at AWS, leading a team of software partner development (PDM) folks, working with partners in the Asia Pacific region, and really excited to chat with you about how how we've talking to a lot of AWS partner managers, and I don't think I've talked to anybody yet in the Asia Pacific region, so we have a lot to talk about.
Excellent.
That's Trevor, maybe we could start there, and could you share a little bit more about what you and your team are up to in the region?
Yeah, so thanks, Chip. So I've been in the organization about 5 years, almost 5 years. And so our team is particularly focused on mostly public sector partners in the Australian Pacific region. And so anyone who has built and run software in the platform who has a particularly substantial growth ambition, we're interested in working with them. So some of our larger partners are interested in expansion, so that's a big one. Some of the geographies around the world which they haven't been to, that's the sort of thing we'll help them come up to speed on. And secondarily to that, some of our smaller partners want to sort of move into the next phase. I mean, to use a well-trodden path, some of them use the phrase, crossing the chasm is where they're at in their life cycle. And so moving into the next phase of growth and look to us to say, where do we go next and how can we help them kind of bridge that gap into the next phase of growth? That's a lot of the work that we do.
Yeah, interesting. And there's, I think, so much opportunity, right, for partners. AWS is fundamentally, a platform, and so the AWS has you've built a lot of partner relationships and an ecosystem of partners that are built on AWS, and so it's a very naturally cooperative kind of relationship like that. So how do you see that developing in the region with some of the partners that you're working with?
Yeah, so one of the things that's changed in the broader marketplace, and certainly it has in Australia, I was talking earlier about crossing the chasm, right? We've been in this market 10, 15 years, and we've got to the point now where the early adopters and enthusiasts about cloud technology we're getting to exhaustion on that portion of the market. Where we're moving to is a model where the end customers are more interested in a holistic service they don't have to put together from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge departure from where we have been historically, because obviously our business has been focused on data center migrations and infrastructure, which is where we really built our straps. But now we see more of a buyer rather than a builder culture from a buyer perspective. And so our engagement has shifted in recent years, probably the last couple of years, to software partners who are having a much more business-focused conversation, because the way that we enable them to pull the platform consumption behind them is fundamentally important. So some of our line of business partners who solve a particular problem in healthcare or education or law enforcement, something like that, the infrastructure is less important in the end customer's conversation, but it's fundamentally important to solving an actual real life business problem for them. So that's been a big change for us that we've definitely seen is accelerated the software partner business in the last probably 12 to 18 months.
That's really interesting. So then it sounds like you're working almost like an orchestrator to bring the right partners together for a solution in the market. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there's often a consortium approach that's required because
Mm-hmm.
you'll have a lead partner who has engagement, but more than 50% of the time they'll say to us, the customer wants something that we really don't do. And a good example of that is the weather service here went out for a disaster management system, and a couple of our partners kind of went for that. But there's this kind of hairy bit around the edge where they like a 24/7 team of people who can be stood up at a moment's notice if a weather event would happen. And the partners are all kind of looking at each other going, that bit looks quite challenging. And so putting them together with a consulting partner who can stand that team up, but they provide the technology behind it, that seems to be a common approach, particularly in the larger engagements that we've got with customers. So that's a new mechanism we've had to establish at AWS where we get partners to collaborate, which can also be a bit tricky because you occasionally have crossover in what the partners do. And so agreeing who's going to be in which swim lane is sometimes a bit of a dance.
Right. Well, it's interesting. At reInvent, one of the big announcements that that Matt and team had is around tri-party or multi-party agreements and or relationships, and so I think that's essentially what you're talking about, right? It's not a single partner that's coming to the. It's multiple partners. It could be two at least, but could be even more.
Yeah, exactly right. And the end customers often, the feedback we always get is, there are certain things which end customers would love to build themselves, or they have the capacity or capability to do so. But increasingly, they're looking at these things going, I just want to solve this problem. And I'd love a group of people, hopefully, who I don't have to manage each individual partner myself, ideally, would be able to solve this problem for me. So that's where the partner network and, groups of relationships between them really come to the fore. So it works well.
Yeah. How do you, because you mentioned at the beginning that your one of your KPIs or the what you're trying to do with your partners is to help them grow. How do those two come together? Is it valuable? Do you see more growth when there are multiple partners?
Yeah, there definitely is. And it's mainly because scale is hard to achieve on your own. And so a tailwind that helps you to grow disproportionately where you don't have to have your sales rep or chief revenue officer in every conversation, that's ideally where you want to get to. Many of our partners who are, say, 50, 60 people, which is a reasonable organization, but still a small business, have trouble with that. So if we think about the way that they scale across lots of customer engagements or revenue, etc., the question is always, how many extra salespeople do I hire? And then how much more marketing do I need to do to ingest all those customers? All of that conversation is less prominent if you can build ecosystem networks. It's almost like partnerships within the partner network, which help them to grow with each other. So they virtually link arms together and can accelerate faster than they otherwise would. I mean, an old mentor of mine used to use the phrase 2 + 2 = 5, and that's exactly the kind of thing that seems to happen.
Yeah. Well, I think I think what you're talking about is co-selling, right? Because you've got a broader network and bigger sphere of influence when you have multiple partners. Is that how you think of it as well?
Yeah, definitely. Because,
Yeah.
and even thinking of how a channel within a channel might work. And so you might have a software provider that provides 30% of the problem solving, but they may not have the scale to go to market in and of themselves. And so they might decide to have another partner white label that service on a particular opportunity. Once that muscle memory is built, it's much easier for them to say, actually, this really worked for this industry. Why don't we create a go-to-market for that specific type of service? So the collaboration between those partners from a co-sell point of view is also something we at AWS don't have to nurture beyond the first couple of interactions. So scaling ourselves and scaling the partner businesses, that network is hugely valuable from a productivity point of view.
Yeah, it's interesting that's and are you seeing because you talked about smaller partners, are you seeing the sort of a balance of small partners, regional partners working with each other or with other larger partners as well? Or both? All the above?
It's a bit of a mix, because often our smaller partners have built a niche solution that can be repeatable but doesn't solve everything that the end customer would like to solve. And so that's a common one where, and a good example of this is if I think about in the education industry, so universities and colleges, they might want to rethink how they do student management or admissions, for example. And a small partner has often, in fact, we had this situation recently where a small partner has built a curriculum management system. Now, that's only one step of a whole student life cycle, but buddying them together with a finance specialist and a partner who works in higher education every day, that seems to work better, because then you can have a conversation much higher in the organization from a business outcomes point of view. Works much more easily, and you're less prone as a partner to be benchmarked on the price of a migration or the cost of the people to execute that, because you're actually solving a business problem that has value in and of itself. So that has been working really well.
Yeah. That's interesting. So it also helps you, I mean, something you just said, I think is interesting. It helps you get higher in the organization as you're talking more about business value and business outcomes.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And it means it's less about technology. I mean, the technology gets pulled along with it, which is fantastic for us because we're all about platform consumption. But what it means is the time to value is much faster as well, because there's time pressure often to solve a business problem that has real value or is really painful for the end customer. Whereas the technological sell around solving a technology problem can sometimes get, particularly in public sector partners, can be snarled up in governance and benchmarking and discovery and engineering and all of those things before you even get to execution. So that's an acceleration play that works really well.
Interesting. You talked about the sort of constellation of different ISVs coming together, or maybe there's a player that has a larger capability, but there's they have some small capabilities that a partner has that brings it. And basically, you're sort of talking about co-building, right? These partners coming together and building a solution. Maybe there's an integration. What's that dynamic like, and what's the impetus for the dynamic? Are they typically is it something that's sort of outside in, or is it coming from a customer, like they've tried it with one customer and it's worked, or is it something where you see they're sort of looking at the overall market and thinking about pulling something together, or what do you typically see?
We actually find that more often than not, we're leading this conversation around a constellation of partners, because of the fact that one of the difficult things is when you're in a business on your own, you're like executing, it's often challenging to take not just one, but like 3 steps back to think about how would we attack this entire market. So some organizations are like partners of ours are easier to kind of get them around to that way of thinking, and others are more challenging. But what we are ultimately encouraging them to do is to think bigger than they're currently thinking and consider what could be done, which would be disproportionately bigger than what they're currently doing, because otherwise on a day-to-day basis, that's all they do. They focus on their wheelhouse and what they want to execute with their customers and or prospects. And so getting them to think about that more broadly it can be a real light bulb moment for some who really understand that. The chief revenue officers and personas like that in our partners are the ones who kind of that click straight away, which is valuable because that's the kind of thing that drives much more rapid growth from the partners, rather than the technology-led conversation, as much as I love technology, and we all do.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense, because the CROs are the ones that, it's going to help them achieve their goals, right?
That's right. That's exactly right.
And bring more value to customers.
Exactly. The chief revenue officer is often the one who's pinned with a pretty enormous growth ambition. And so some way to do that doesn't involve hiring another 10 sales reps, or, as much as I love sales reps, is always valuable to those folks. Yeah.
Trevor, I'd love to dive in a little bit to the unique, challenges and opportunities, being in the Asia Pacific region. You're based in Brisbane.
Yes.
But your region is 600 some countries and, islands, and spread over, thousands of square miles. How do you manage all of that? I guess some of it is on, of course, video conference, but I'm sure you're on a plane quite a bit.
Yeah. Less than I used to be, thankfully. But one of the keys, we use the word scale a lot, but one of the things that is critical to doing something like that is having an awareness of what actually really motivates a partner. And when I think about spread across islands, for example, if I think about the Pacific region is a good example, like when we're talking about Papua New Guinea, Tonga, Solomon Islands, like all of these places in the Pacific, where we just, as an organization, we, and particularly myself, couldn't hope to execute across all those places. You need to find partners who are either based in those regions and or have an existing business there. And so they have an inherent motivation when I'm not in the room to drive business in those locations, because otherwise what we've often found is our partners who are headquartered in Sydney, for example, they'll be opportunistic about executing in those regions. And if something comes up, they're happy to go after it, but they're often reticent to get on a plane and go and spend time with the customer in Tonga, for example. And Tonga's a good example of a place where we have a partner actually who's based out of Papua New Guinea, and they're happy to traverse islands and solve problems that include, poor connectivity and people on bits of software who are getting on boats and planes every day just to get to work. These sorts of problems that don't exist in other places. And so that's been a fundamental revelation, certainly for me, that you can't just assume partners in other countries or other geographies can simply execute in other places. Because as soon as you walk away and I'm not in the room, or there's no obvious near-term opportunity, the impetus to drive those things kind of evaporates, which is a bit of a pity. So yeah, that's been key to us working out how we scale across all of those places. Yeah, that's been a big one.
So are those partners typically services partners, resellers, combination of both?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mix, and so it's software partners and services or consulting partners are the main ones. There's also an aspect of, we talk about geography and spread, but we've also got disparity in socioeconomics. So I think about Australia and New Zealand have much higher socioeconomic demographics than, say, the Solomon Islands, for argument's sake. And so we need to often think about how we go to market there with respect to training partners, capability building, and all of that kind of thing. And so skills are hard to come by in places like that. And the feedback certainly that I've received from government officials in Pacific Island nations is that they would like to build more of a skill base so that technology companies and partners of ours can hire local people and execute locally, rather than having to rely on us or other parties to come in from Australia or Singapore or the US even to try and build these things for them. So that's a unique challenge.
Yeah. And how is that going?
Incredibly well, actually, surprisingly. We've struck a bit of a balance there where we can fund and provide capability from an engineering point of view for partners who are based in places like that, which has been hugely helpful. We've had to, one thing that's a little bit new in those places is we've had to work extensively with either government agencies and or entities like universities who are producing graduates and the skills that we need. And the third group has probably been international donors, World Bank and the like, those sorts of organizations who normally fund development projects are starting to come around to the idea that actually technology is infrastructure as well.
Interesting. So it's one is encouraging, providing, I guess, communicating and getting people to sort of raise their hand, but then also you're finding sources of funding for those education programs as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that around, but like we talked about earlier, it's a little bit like forming a consortium approach where there are funders and other organizations working in these locations who want to do the best they can, but often don't have a clear view of what the solution to some of these problems in developing nations might be. And so coming together with a group of partners to try and solve that together with the funder, that's often a game changer for those places, because otherwise what you end up with is partners solving individual problems, which is fantastic on its own, but it just doesn't scale.
Not
and it's
scalable.
not repeatable.
Yeah. Interesting. Oh, that's cool. How about the, there are other challenges, language challenges, cultural challenges, local, regulations and governing bodies and things like that. It just seems like a really complicated problem to solve.
Yeah. I mean, I use the word context or local context a lot. And when I say to people, you have to spend time particularly with the partner, understanding local context. And when we bring a consortium together, I often spend a lot of time getting them to understand each other's context, because particularly when you bring in a consortium partner who's perhaps not based in somewhere that's different for them, that can be a bit challenging to come up to speed quickly on why you would or wouldn't work in certain ways. And so that's a unique challenge where particularly partners of ours have to understand how things operate in different countries, and perhaps countries that aren't developed or Western nations. That's quite tricky. So having a partner who can give us the local context is hugely important. That's been fundamental to how we would operate in places like that.
Yeah, yeah. How I'm curious also, Trevor, because your focus is more on public sector.
Mhm.
How is that? How have you seen that to be different than private sector and in your role and in bringing partners together?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in many different roles and worked with private sector customers predominantly through my career. My last couple of roles have been public sector focused. One of the things, one of the challenges, obviously, that everybody sees is that decision making and speed to execute is a challenge in public sector,
Mm,
primarily because the governance involved is one thing, but also thinking about how you solve a quite complicated citizen facing problem is not particularly easy to do. And
mm,
so those customers in the public sector often need a more holistic problem solving approach that has a kind of a bow around it, I always say. And so that's difficult sometimes for vendors to understand, because individual providers or vendors will always turn up with their particular thing, and they want to drive growth on their particular niche, but that often doesn't work. It's a slow sales cycle finding the individual person who wants to buy your niche product. But if you can take time in the public sector businesses to understand their context and bring that consortium approach together and package it in such a way that it's solving an actual real life citizen facing problem, that's much easier. And so that's the kind of thing that I've found to be much more successful than just kind of showing up with your thing. And I mean, we suffer from this as much as any other organization, in the sense that sometimes our public sector customers don't want to buy an AWS tenancy. What they actually want is to solve a local municipalities' issues around repairing pavements at speed. Now,
mm,
getting the partners in who can improve the way that they manage repair requests, or they manage workforces in the field in order to get them to the right locations and those types of things, it's not really what we do. But in a partner context, we can do that, bringing those parties together. And so then speeding up the conversation to getting time to value and reducing the sales cycle, it is much easier when you take an approach like that.
It makes complete sense. You're basically, what you're saying is you're helping to simplify and clarify the business value for your customer, which takes some of the, I would think, takes some of the anxiety out of the buying process.
Yeah, it most certainly does,
Yeah.
because and a good example of this is local government, so municipalities, things like that. They often don't have 30 people in IT to learn how to put a solution together themselves.
Right.
Neither do they have the impetus to try and do that. And so coming to them with a problem that is solved by lots of moving parts that are managed by the partners, or even often fronted by one who will prime it and manage the partnerships behind the scene,
Mm-hmm.
that just works hugely well, because assuming that those folks in that municipality, or the hundreds that exist around Australia, for example, in the Pacific, can digest that technology in a way that they can make meaningful use of it, it just doesn't work. And so often those places will have, a small technology team, or they might even have part-time folks, they just don't have the capacity to build these things themselves, which is
right.
a huge opportunity. That's how we see it.
Yeah. Trevor, this has been fantastic. Gosh, I think we could keep going for quite a while here. And I know you're just starting your day, so you have a bunch of things on your plate, but I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your thoughts and challenges and opportunities in Australia and the Asia Pacific region. It's been fantastic.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. It's been great to be on.
Terrific. So, Trevor, thank you. Thank you all for joining. And on behalf of Trevor Manokore, Chip Rodgers saying thanks, everybody, for joining again. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.